Thank you. Again, thank you to our speakers. Thank you to Brandon Lewis. I think your first appearance on our platform as chairman of the Conservative Party. Look forward to hearing what you have to say about England and the Union.
Thank you. Thank you, Dean, and thank you for inviting me this afternoon. It's always a great pleasure to be with Policy Exchange in any format, and as you say, it's my first time as chairman of the Conservative Party, a role I'm hugely proud to be able to fulfil, because it's now over 100 years since my party became the Conservative and Unionist Party. And through a century now of change, I would argue that the Union of the United Kingdom has remained a core part of our country's identity. As Unionists, we don't just cherish it because of our shared and proud history. I think that we cherish it because it's becoming more important in ensuring the prosperity and security for everyone across these aisles, in all corners of our United Kingdom. For me, as someone who was born in London, grew up between Essex and Norfolk, and now serves as a Member of Parliament for Great Yarmouth, I have seen how our union and England's place within it has changed during my lifetime in ways that make me optimistic about the future. Since the Act of the Union in 1707, we have at times experienced a tumultuous past. Hundreds of years ago, we spent rather a lot of our energy fighting each other. But I am, for one, grateful that that is, generally at least, a distant memory. In more recent years, our country has changed for the better. We are working together. But there are two specific things that I would argue have made the most impact over the last 20 or so years. Firstly, I'll touch on devolution. I think a huge credit is due to everybody who has been involved in moving devolution forward, because devolving powers to Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland has made this country different and I think improved by changing us for the better. Over the last few decades, through what has been momentous political and constitutional change, the Conservative Party has been on its own journey with devolution as well. Our record in government is a good one. The two Scotland Acts have made Holyrood one of the most powerful parliaments of its kind in the world, with substantial new tax and welfare powers. And we have developed a modern industrial strategy which supports the industries of the future, where Northern Ireland particularly is at the cutting edge. And last year's Wales Act marked the coming of age for Welsh devolution, putting more decisions, more powers into the hands of Welsh ministers, giving them the important powers and new powers that they need to grow the Welsh economy. And as devolution itself has evolved, with it each nation has grown in its political and its own cultural identity even further. And I think as a result of that, our union has become stronger. Because principally, we are one nation. Yes, we have strong and differing identities, but we come together as one nation. The fact that you can come from any corner of the world and still be Scottish, Welsh, Northern Irish, Cornish, or even a Norfolkian, and yet still be British, that is the spirit that makes the United Kingdom truly special and pretty much, by definition, unique. The essence of our unity is that we can pool those shared resources that we have, and at times the risks. That sees the size actually of your individual economy of any one of our nations or population doesn't make us any more or less important in that greater good. It makes us equal partners. And that's why the United Kingdom is so unique, and why it has been such a force for good, not just in this country, but I would argue around the world. And the second development I would argue for is that citizens of our country have created for themselves an inclusive and actually a thoughtful identity, one based on the values of freedom, fairness and justice, principles that are not just shared in England under the St George's Cross, but right across the whole Union. In England, it is important that people feel able to celebrate their English identity as well as their British identity. And that's something I think we've shied away from at times. But it is now more important than ever. I represent a constituency that voted over 70% to leave the European Union. And many of them voted with optimism about the future for Britain, a future that is more outward-looking, with a close connection to the Commonwealth, as close a connection to the Commonwealth and elsewhere in the world as with the EU. And I know that people in this country want to see both. They want to see a Britain that is more united and one that has strong links across the globe, taking a lead on the world stage. And that is exactly what a Conservative government is focused on delivering. As a Unionist, I will never stop saying why standing together as one nation is in the interest of all our nations. As a united kingdom, we are able to sustain the largest defence spending in Europe. We're able to lead from the front in NATO and in the UN Security Council. Our standing on that world stage not only makes the UK safer, but we make the world safer. And no single part of our union could do that on its own. I feel more secure because of our union. And as the world's 5th largest economy, being part of this union makes us all more prosperous as well. Our economy is successful and stable because we have a shared currency, a central bank, and a shared positive interest. Our businesses are able to thrive thanks to UK-wide investment. And I've seen this myself, even recently when visiting Wales and looking at the 80% of their work that is linked to the economy of the UK as a whole. It's just one example of a range of practical benefits which are unique to our union and come as a result of our shared common goals. They empower each and every nation, and in doing so, that empowers our wider United Kingdom. As chairman of the Conservative Party, a party of the Union, I am committed to working in the best interests of people right across the United Kingdom. And I'm proud that under a Conservative government, the devolved administrations have been given even more power and greater influence than ever before. As I said, just last week I was in Wales. Next week I'll be in Scotland, as I have been more recently in my previous roles. And over the summer I'll be in Northern Ireland. And in my travels I see this firsthand. A Britain where in all 4 corners, different cultures, different histories and faiths have in themselves enhanced our identity. I see a Britain where political, constitutional and technical change means that we now know and understand more about our 4 nations than ever before. Our union is not yet perfect. It is a project. But it's a project that's based on a shared history. It's bound together by a common desire to share the risks and the rewards that it brings. It is a beacon of democracy, freedom and justice for people right around the world. Now, I am deeply proud to be able to call myself English, but I'm even prouder to be British. Now, as many of you in this room might be sitting here this morning, just like me, you may well be a living, breathing example of the multi-layered identities that we all have. On my mother's side, my family can trace its roots back to the Domesday Book in England, to gun tartan in its time in Scotland, and on my father's side to Poland. But the fact that all of us are becoming more aware and more confident to be able to speak about our genealogy, about our multi-layered identities, that, I think, is testament to the power of devolution, to not only reflect on and understand our past, but to shape our future. It's only by drawing on the strength from all of our parts and seeing our values as the principles that bind this great country together that we can continue to thrive. We may be 4 nations, but at our core, we are one people. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Brandon. Now my pleasure to call upon Jim Murphy. Jim, you've done 1 or 2 important addresses with us over the years. You launched Labour's Defence Policy Review with us some years ago, Shadow Secretary of State, and did your valedictory address as leader of the Labour Party in Scotland with us. So this is another inflection point. Look forward to hearing what you have to say.
Well, thank you, Dean. It's great to follow you, Brandon, and I saw in your comments in the Times this morning, I think it then got cut out of your speech, perhaps one of your advisors took it out, about imploring all 4 people of all 4 nations to support England in the World Cup. That's something you can. That's something you can try next week when you're in Scotland. There's no point in using your best material here. You can use it when you go there. And the second thing is, it is really great to follow you, but I have got to be careful, because it was this sort of chummy camaraderie that when I was involved in the senior leadership of the Scottish Labour Party during the Better Together campaign, it was the perception of enjoying the company of Conservatives that got me and my party into so much difficulty. But notwithstanding that, Brandon, it's lovely to share a platform with you. Really, what I wanted to do today is just reflect. The advantage I had was 3 years ago I came and spoke at Policy Exchange, and I don't think I've uttered a syllable in public ever since. I don't tweet. I don't think I've got a Facebook account. If I have, it's a parody account. It's not mine. But I'm one of those minority of Scots who voted for both of Scotland's unions, the union in 2014 and the union of 2016. And I still fervently believe in both. Now I'll save you from my amateur analytics or of my take on why I believe Brexit is a conscious act of geopolitical self-harm. That's for another day and a different discussion. I do so even though I was the Minister for Europe who introduced an arcane, never-to-be-used clause in the law, Article 50, that when we debated it in the House of Commons, we anticipated it would never be used. So more importantly than rehashing a discussion about the EU or Brexit, I want to offer the perspective of an individual Briton, rather than just a Scot, on this very English question of what type of union will England share in the future. And as an individual, I have no line to push and simply want to offer observations. I'll offer 4 of them. And those around whom the observations are aimed will see it as a criticism, and that's fine, because there's enough observations to go around. I make it of each of the political parties. But I start also by saying again that I am not and never have been, and I don't think ever will be, a unionist. I'm not. I'm a social democrat, for whom the union is an intrinsic part and an enabler of a sharing of risk, reward and resource. I fought many general elections, 5 of which where my name was on the ballot paper as a candidate, from when I first won in 1997 until I was defeated in 2015. And the most important vote I ever took part in was one where my name wasn't on the ballot paper, the 2014 referendum to keep Scotland in the United Kingdom, even though I am not a classic unionist. But nor am I a nationalist, because I don't believe in any form of national exceptionalism. I think there's far too much of it to go around. But because I'm not a nationalist, and despite not being a unionist, I went round Scotland in my iron brew crates that some of you saw, and 100 impromptu street meetings, iron brew pre-sugar tax. I have no idea what it would be now, but anyway, I did so not because there's no validity in eulogising a shared history, but because I think there's a contemporary utility of a union of this island or these islands. So in the 3 years, as I said, since I left politics, I've kept my counsel and watched politics from the middle distance. I still believe that politics is a noble cause, but one of its least attractive characteristics is when those with influence deliberately confuse their personal ambition with their party's future. And much worse still is when those self-same people then conflate their party's interests with those of our country's interest. And we've all seen far too much of that over the past 6 months. Now, one final point of introduction was something that strikes me as I listen to nationalists the world over, is that they believe in the intrinsic exceptionalism of their people, whatever their people is, but they also remarkably believe in the exceptionalism of their nationalism, that it's uniquely different from every other vintage or version. And that mistake is also true on these islands. So to run through my 4 brief points. Firstly, about Scotland and Northern Ireland. Those two people have much in common, not least they were the two countries in the United Kingdom who voted by a big majority to remain fully in the European Union, the single market, and much else besides. But I think as a consequence of much that has been happening in our politics, the Union of Great Britain is stronger, while the Union of the United Kingdom is weaker. I can say this because, from my perspective, contemporary Scottish and Irish nationalisms are opposites of one another. Political nationalism in Northern Ireland is, as far as I'm concerned, about breaking from a political union to share an island union, while Scottish nationalism is about breaking from an island union with no certainty of joining anything else as an alternative. Of course, Northern Ireland can rejoin the EU, possibly if it joins an island union, but Scotland has no clear path back into full membership of the EU. And I think that many people in Northern Ireland will increasingly look southwards in their relations by small, incremental, daily human interactions, the aggregate of which will continue to change Northern Ireland. And I think that England will have to come to terms with a Northern Ireland where there is more focus on the word Ireland than there is on the word Northern. And to me, as an outside observer, I think that, of course, unionism in Northern Ireland would win a border poll, judging by all the opinion polls. But sometimes the DUP's arguments and unionist arguments sound a bit like a reheat of Ulster Says No campaigns back in the 1980s. Secondly, turning to the issue of Scottish independence precisely, I think that the harder the Brexit, the harder Scottish independence would be to achieve. Now, that's not an argument in favour of a hard Brexit, it's just my reflection of a truth. Because the SNP's policy has previously been built around the concept of independence in Europe. But in a future Britain of hard Brexit, if Scotland were able to persuade the Scottish public, and importantly, the Spanish government, that it should be allowed to rejoin the EU as a new member state, or even allowed into the EEA, there remain enormous unanswered questions. For example, back in 2014 referendum, our assertion that independence may lead to a border was attacked. But under a hard Brexit, an independent Scotland with an established relationship with Europe would necessitate an EU Scotland and Brexit England border. Thirdly, British politicians have an influence on all of this, of course, and England has a distinct say. But that should be a cause for concern for many, because on occasion, and I don't mean this as an attempt to persuade, but simply to reflect, on occasion in the past, despite the name of the party, the Conservative government has on occasion been cavalier with its island union instead of being its guarantor. My mind became firm in this at an unusual time and a historic day. The time was 3 o'clock in the morning and the day was the 15th of September 2014. Michael Gove and we have very civil disagreements about lots of things. Michael Gove and I were discussing the referendum result, and he announced that the British government had plans for English votes for English laws, and that very next day David Cameron was meeting Tory MPs at Chequers to discuss that very policy. That was cavalier. A guarantor of the Union would have come to Scotland and helped bring people together. David Cameron had worked tirelessly and very effectively in that referendum, but at that moment he was prone to cavalierism. I was angry then, and I remain disappointed now. Fourthly, about the nature of politics in England. I feel that political parties in England should be avowedly emotionally English while being proudly politically British. Being emotionally English and politically British, I think back to the general election of 2015 and the very effective Conservative Party adverts of Ed Miliband in Nicola Sturgeon's pocket. They were brilliant. I didn't agree with them, but they were brilliant. One of your predecessors, exceptional work, Brandon. I mean, they were highly effective and they appealed to political England. And that's fine. as a tactical election poster, but it is dangerous for the Union if it ever becomes a strategic political frame for the significant elements of politicians in England. So I think that English politicians of all parties have a responsibility to the Union, part of which is accepting its imperfections. Part of the deal of being the numerically dominant partner is an acceptance of issues that sometimes are difficult to take, such as, yes, the thing that's been discussed already, the Barnett formula. So I worry about British politics post-Brexit. My own party continues on a previously untested journey, of which I remain a member, but don't agree with many of the things that are happening. And separately, well, some in Scotland still have the ability in a post-Brexit world to blame a distant other in the shape of a distant London. Nationalists in England will go in search of someone else to blame. And shorn of the EU, I'm not sure where that frustration and anger will go. So in conclusion, the Scottish Labour Party, which I led for 20 odd weeks, and the word odd has two deliberate meanings there, numerical and literal, which I led for 20 odd weeks, got the balance between emotion and reason wrong. We were out of kilter in the politics of reason and the politics of emotion and the politics of reason. In Scotland, we were considered both emotionally and politically British above all else. And our clumsiness on the former made us more vulnerable on the latter. And I humbly suggest that there are enormous lessons for all of the political parties in England about the experiences and the difficulties of the Scottish Labour Party over the past 5 years. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jim. Thank you, Brandon. We've got a few minutes for questions now before I see there's a number of hands up. Lady there in the middle, name and organisation.
Hi, Naomi Lloyd-Jones, Hertford College, Oxford. I've got a question for both the panellists. Brandon, you talk about the need for English identity to be expressed as much as British identity. What do you feel are the essential tenets of Englishness and how do they differ from Britishness? And then Jim Murphy, you talk about the idea of it being dangerous for conservative unionists to be portraying politicians as in the pocket of a particular subset of nationalists. But I would argue that one of the central tenets of the Conservative and Unionist Party as reconfigured in the 1880s was the idea that their opponents, the Liberals at that point in time, were in the pockets of the Irish nationalists, and that was what was going to undermine Union, as Union was understood in that period as being the Union of 1801. So how do you reconcile that with what the Conservative and Unionist Party has been traditionally?
Well, I'll take your first part first. I'm afraid you credited me with a much deeper analysis of what I was saying than where I was coming from. I mean, in terms of the Englishness, and apart from Jim's point about having that eternal optimism that all four nations might support England in the World Cup, I'm definitely going to use that in my speech to the Scottish Conservatives next week. Well, actually, the point I was making, or attempted to make, was a much lighter, if you like, level than that, which was, over the years, I've been invited to and been to, and people all over this country will celebrate fantastically on St Patrick's Day, St Andrew's Day, and actually when it comes to St George's Day, there has been periods of time where the English become very, very concerned about not looking jingoistic and are a bit cautious around it. And I think actually part of what's so brilliant about our four nations is that we do have these things we can celebrate, and we should celebrate. That's what I mean by being confident enough to celebrate what being English and to not be fearful of being accused of being too jingoistic or too nationalistic or whatever it may be, because somebody, we've seen all the tweets in the past about Union Jack flags or St George's flags hanging in different places. Actually, we should be as proud of that as a Scot is of celebrating St Patrick's Day and those kind of things. And I just think we should celebrate all four nations. We in England shouldn't shy away from celebrating St George's Day. It is part of what makes everything greater. I'm a very firm believer that I think every part of the nations has its own unique things about it, whether it's the scenery, whether it's the economy, whether it's its culture and its history. But I think actually what makes Great Britain so great is how that comes together. I think it's one of the best examples in the world of the sum being greater than any of the parts.
And just to pick up on the point, I mean, my issue wasn't the advert, it was a highly effective advert. My issue is, it's a slightly different point which I didn't refer to, which is that in talking to my Conservative friends, one of the things that they found most appealing about David Cameron and what he was seeking to achieve was trying to make the Conservative Party a little bit more like London. Multicultural, diverse, so less like the part of England below London and more like London itself, and then win the votes of people outside of London. And I think there was an attempt there to turn the Conservative Party into the national party. Like, I didn't vote for it, I didn't agree with it, but I could see a coherence that says we, and I spoke to Daniel Finkelstein about this recently, where totemically the metropolitan city of Manchester would be totemic of that sense of national project, if you like. And to a very large degree that's dissipated. And I worry that instead of the party being trying to be or the national party, it becomes a nationalist party. And I don't think it's healthy. And that's the point I was making. I'm making an observation rather than a criticism, but it does worry me.
I see a lot of other questions. Gentleman there, towards.
Hi, Kevin Haig, Chairman of these islands again. Jim, I thought you made a very good point about a hard Brexit, making Scottish independence harder, because of course it forces a choice between markets in a way that they could at least pretend they didn't have to make a choice before. I wonder if there's a flip side of that, which is those who have argued for Brexit on the basis of taking back control, how hard it becomes for them then to argue against Scottish nationalists who will also argue that what they are trying to do is take back control.
Just brief. Do you want me to go first?
He asked you.
I was referring to you.
Yeah, sure. One of the things I've always found somewhat ironic at best around the argument the SNP make more generally is about wanting to break up the union that's got the longest history and the most intrinsic links, whilst arguing to stay in the European Union. I say somebody voted Remain, like Jim. So I've always thought and if you look at the voting patterns from the referendum and then through the general elections, I actually think there's a difficulty of the SNP in holding that argument in a way that makes them coherent. I think it undermines their ability to be authentic because they're literally arguing one thing and doing another. I think that has an effect because it does impact on what people think, because people do, at one level or another, recognise when politicians are literally saying one thing and doing another. And I think that's effectively what they're doing. I think that is quite difficult for them as a party. But I think what I think has been interesting, and Ruth may talk about this later on, but is if you look at the coverage over the last year or so, and when I've been in Scotland, certainly even dealing with people on the independent side of the debate, there is a kind of view, and I think it's not dissimilar to where we are with Brexit as well, that the vote's been done, decision was made, let's make this work. And I therefore think they will struggle to continue to make that case. There's therefore opportunities in Scotland. I think the general election showed this last year around, what else does the SNP stand for in terms of what they can deliver. So I think there's some wider political issues for them that come out of that. And that is why every now and again I suspect we will see, as we have done today, Nicola Sturgeon effectively looking for an excuse to go back to the one core issue that does give them a USP over anybody else and to try and make it relevant again. But I think she'll struggle.
If you call that, which doesn't answer the question, which is those who have argued for Brexit, which may not be you, I recognise, but those who have argued for Brexit based on taking back control. The flip side of all those arguments you just made is the SNP can say, well, it's inconsistent for you to be arguing for the if you want to take back control of stockpiles as they see it.
Oh yeah, but that comes. Yeah, well, no, it's a fair point, but that comes back to as we take control back from the EU, you've got to build on the devolution that's already happened. So what we have been seeking to do, which actually, to be fair, the previous Labour government started that journey with the Scottish government around actually devolving power. I mean, I would argue, and this is the point I made, slightly different, but it's the same principle. For us as a Conservative government, I mean, the first thing I did as an MP was sit on the Localism Act. It's about devolving power generally away from Westminster and closer to people. And part of that is obviously about devolving it to the four nations. So it is very much about getting not just power back from Europe, but getting power to where it's most effective.
Just to briefly pick up on it as well, I think that many, if not most of the Brexiteers of 2016 sounded like an Alex Salmond tribute band. They just did. It was the same tunes, the same instruments, the same lyrics, different target. One was successful and one was less successful. And the second point, just briefly as well, is that as someone, one of the 48%, I think I must feel as disenfranchised by what's happening now as I'm sure many of the 45% of Scottish nationalists felt in the period after the Scottish independence referendum, although after the Scottish independence referendum we had further series of devolution in the delivery of the vow. And there's been nothing of that sort post the Brexit referendum, so I feel completely disenfranchised by the whole process. But I think your first point's fair. It's the same side of a similar coin.
I'm sorry, because time is short. Please, I hope those who are disappointed will forgive me. Thank you all for coming. Thank you, particularly to our two panelists.
Good luck with your. Where are you going to Scotland?
See you all again at